the things that have semantical content and are syntactic in structure, namely the labels on the light bulb, have no causal role in the workings of the machine. This is just notation for the programmer. The programmer, as it were, draws things on the light bulb, labels his nodes, draws things on the light bulb, simply in order to keep track of how he's understanding the process which eventuates on in this light bulb turning on when this one turns on. The things that are syntactically structured are not the things that are content-bearing in this device. The things that are syntactically structured are the labels on the light bulb, and they have no causal role in the machine. The things that are content-bearing are states of excitation of the nodes, and they have a causal role in the machine. When this node becomes excited, it causes this node to become excited. But although they have a causal role, they have no syntactical linguistic structure. Here's another way of putting the difference between these two machines. In a classical machine, there are two primitive relations between the content-bearing entities of the machine, between the states of the machine to which content is assigned, that is, tape states. One kind of relation is causal. Having a certain thing on the tape causes the device to print something else on the tape. The other kind of relation is syntactic. It's the relation that the conclusion bears to the premise when you infer P from P and Q. It's that relation in virtue of which the conclusion of the argument is a token of the same linguistic type, of the same syntactic structure as one of the constituents of the premise of the argument. Okay? So in a classical machine, there are two primitive relations among the content-bearing states of the mechanism. There's a causal relation in virtue of which things that you write on the tape causes the machine to do things. And there's a constituent relation, constituent linguistic relation, syntactic relation, in virtue of which, for example, the conclusion of the argument from P and Q to P is a formula of the same linguistic form as the first clause of the premise of the argument is P and Q. So you've got two primitive relations here. You've only got one here. The only primitive relation among the content-bearing states in a connectionist network is causal. There isn't any syntactical relation. Syntactically, all the nodes are atomic. So now we have two answers, not one, to the question, how could states transitions of a mechanism preserve semantical properties? How can a mechanism model the inference from P and Q to P? And notice these, prima facie at least, these two answers, these two models of inference-making mechanisms, these two models differ in simplicity. The classical Turing model is a intrinsically more complicated model than the network model, because the classical Turing model requires both syntactical and causal relations among the things that are semantically evaluated, the states of the machine that have content, whereas the network model requires only causal relations. That means that if you want to argue for the classical model as opposed to the network model, the burden of argument's on you, right? Because you've got the more complicated. So now, first polemical question. Can we think of some argument that shows that unless you have both constituent relations and causal relations among the content-bearing states of the mechanism that models your mental inferences, unless you have both of those kinds of relations, the model won't be rich enough to account for known facts about the mind. Can we find an answer of that sort? Yes, I think we can. In fact, I think we can find several. And what I want to do now is to take you through the arguments which prefer a language or thought kind of model to a connections kind of model. I want to display for you some facts about the mind which make it look very much as though Turing's picture about how the mind works, Turing's account of how the mind works, must be roughly correct. At least roughly correct. Maybe exactly correct. But at least, the least we can say for Turing's picture is that it postulates the right population of primitive relations. The mind has to have syntactically structured states, just like Turing says. There's an old-fashioned argument for this that goes back at least 20 or 30 years that Chomsky gave in syntactic structures and has been sort of knocking around in the linguistic and philosophical literature ever since. It seems to me quite a good argument. And as I say, it's familiar. There's nothing surprising about it. The way the argument goes is this. Look, There are infinitely, at least for people, whatever it may be like for chihuahuas and pigeons and stuff like that, at least for people, there are infinitely many content-distinct mental states that they can have. What is that? Well, nothing exciting. Just things like, but the following array, the following set of objects is the beginning of an infinite set which has no obvious place to stop it. Namely, the thought that 1 and 1 is 2, the thought that 2 and 2 is 4, the thought that 4 and 4 is 8, the thought that 8 and 8 is 16. It looks like, given your representational capacities, you could go on with that series forever. Of course, you couldn't really go on with that series forever because you'd die. Moreover, you'd probably die of boredom even before you died of natural causes. So the suggestion isn't that anybody could really sit down and enumerate all the members of that series. The suggestion is rather that if you ran out, it would be either of patience or of breadth, not of representational capacity. As far as the system that you use to represent the contents of your thought is concerned, that allows you to go on further. Okay? Now, this fact, if you accept the fact, if you accept the idealization to an infinite cognitive capacity, this fact you need to explain. And it turns out that the Turing picture explains it very naturally and with very, very little apparatus. To see how little apparatus you need, consider the following case of an infinite capacity to express distinct messages, to express distinct contents generated out of the most minute amount of formal apparatus. Consider the following fragment, not even of the syntax of English, but just of its lexicography. There are, as you're well undoubtedly aware, this class of objects, missiles. And missiles, roughly speaking, are things that you use to bop your enemies over the head with. Okay, that'll do by way of saying what the semantic content of the expression, the English expression missile is. Notice that there are also anti-missiles. And roughly speaking, those are things that you use to knock down the things that one uses to bop your enemies over the head with. Okay? Notice, however, that there are also anti-missiles. That is, those are things that you use not to knock down missiles, notice, the scope relations count. These are things that you use to knock down the things that you use to knock down the things that you use to bop your enemies over the head with. And, of course, there are also anti-missiles, and it works exactly the same way. The scope, the syntactic scope, the syntax defines the scope of this expression as being this whole thing, so you have to know what the syntactic structure is, and then given the syntactic structure and the meanings of the elements, the thing iterates in a semantically comprehensible way forever, as indeed the Pentagon has noticed. The only bounding conditions on this are what they used to call around MIT a performance constraint, namely that you run out of budget. But notice, you don't run out of semantics. I mean, however crazy you are about your procurement policies, the language will provide you with a mechanism to express your craziness. If you're up to anti-missiles, the language will provide an expression for what it is you're trying to spend the taxpayers' money on, and the syntax and the semantics will combine in that kind of way to tell you exactly which kinds of things you use these kinds of things to knock down the things that you use to knock down the things that you use to knock down, the things that you use to knock down, to hit your enemies over the head with. Okay? So with a very small apparatus, very combinatorially simple apparatus, you can get, if you use the Turing notion of a syntactically structured representational system, you can get just the property that we find that people's thoughts have, namely productivity, a capacity to express an infinite array of semantical contents with a limited, a finite syntactical means. Okay. So that was always the sort of standard reason to support. And of course, notice you can't do this. You can't do this if all you got in your head is a network. Why? Well, because look, a network's a set of nodes. All the nodes are atomic. There may be a very large number of them, but there's only a finite number of them. And when you collect all the labels of all the nodes, that determines the expressive power of the device. So the expressive power of the device, I mean, you could label this one missile, and this one anti-missile, and this one anti-anti-missile, and this one anti-anti-anti-missile, and go on like that. But eventually, since a network is by definition a finite device, you'd run out of nodes to label. And at that point, the device runs out of expressive power. Okay? So if you want to account for the putative infinite productivity of thought, you can't do it with a device where what corresponds to mental representations are syntactically unstructured or atomic. What you need is some mechanism like the Turing mechanism, which allows the things that bear content in your model to also have internal structure. Okay? That's the standard argument for the Turing picture of how the mind is organized. And if you provide this argument to a connectionist, what your pet connectionist is likely to do is he's likely to say, they're likely to bite the bullet. I mean, at least all the connectionists I've talked about with this bite the bullet. That is, they say, no, the idealization to an infinite capacity is not allowable. Actually, there's only a finite number of thoughts you could think, even if you lived forever. And even if memory constraints are real, and attention constraints and stuff like that are relaxed, even under those conditions, you could be in the position of having thought all the things you can think and running out of thoughts. Okay? So that's a way of biting the bullet. That's to say, look, I'm not going to accept this idealization. That raises the following interesting polemical question. I mean, I think the view that the mind is inherently finite is a bizarre view, but I don't want to argue that. I mean, I'm going to just allow it. So what I want to do next is to try to find a sort of finitistic version of a productivity argument. That is, try to find an argument which, like productivity arguments, gives you strong reason to believe that mental states must be syntactically structured, that a good model of mental states will have syntactically structured objects over which it computes. An argument which has that property but doesn't require an idealization to an infinite capacity. Okay? That's what I'll call a systematicity argument. Systematicity arguments are supposed to do that. They're supposed to be arguments for the Turing model that don't require idealization to infinite capacities. So I'm going to try to set out that class of arguments for you to consider. Here's the form of what I'll be doing for the next 5 or 10 minutes. I'll argue first that thought isn't just productive, it's also, as I say, systematic, and that the best explanation of systematicity presupposes a combinatorial syntax and semantics for mental representation, just like the best explanation of productivity does. So I'll argue that it can't be the case that all mental representations are atomic, so it can't be the case that the mind is a connectionist network. That's the form of the argument. What I have to do is to tell you what systematicity is and why it has this implication. And here my strategy will be to start with natural language. That is, I'll show you what systematicity is and what the arguments for it are in the case of natural language, and then show you why, having defined the notion for you, mental representation, thought must be systematic too. Okay, so I'll take natural language, English, as a sort of paradigm case of a system which is systematic, show you what it is for a system to be systematic, system of representation to be systematic, show you why systematicity implies syntactic structure, and then transfer the whole thing to the case of thought. Okay? That's going to be the structure of the argument. Okay, so what I have to do is to tell you what systematicity is, and bizarrely enough, an easy place, a good place to start with that is the very early pages of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, of all places. The investigation starts with a discussion of what Wittgenstein calls the slab game. I want to tell you what the slab game is. This is a game that you play presumably on the cold nights in Cambridge, England, when there is nothing to do. Because if there's anything to do, you don't want to spend your time playing the slab game. It's played in the following way. I stand over here, I'm going to get to be the director in this game. And you stand over here, you're getting to be the serf. And what you have in front of you is a pile of slabs. Now, it's one of the great unknowns of modern history philosophy exactly what a slab is. But we know the following things about it. First of all, slab is not a master, they're individuated. So you can have one slab, two slabs, many slabs. Moreover, they're stackable, so they're not like glass balls. And they're carryable, so they're not like Sherman tanks. Okay? That'll be enough for purposes of telling you what a slab game is. Okay, so you stand over there with a stack of these things in front of you, and I stand over here, and we proceed to play this game. Watch. I say slab. You take, as it might be, though this doesn't really matter, the topmost slab from your pile, carry it over, and place it down in my environment. Again, exactly where doesn't matter. At this point, the game bifurcates. One branch, I either pat you on your head or give you an M&M or something. That's if I'm trying to demonstrate that language learning is really a kind of training. The other branch, I don't reward you. You just go back and the game cycles. Okay, so again, I say slab, and you bring the next slab in your pile, and so on, until you run out of slabs. It is also another of the great unknowns of the history of modern philosophy is what happens then, but it doesn't matter for all purposes. Okay, so that's the slab game, and it's not very interesting. But my wife actually is English, and I have known them to play in her family at Christmas time games that are even more boring than that. So that's the slab game. Wittgenstein says a couple of things about the slab game, which strike me as actually remarkably enough being true. And I want that there too doesn't really much matter to the argument I want to construct. But for what it's worth, I think Wittgenstein's got it right for a change, and I want to quote him approvingly. He says, "We could conceive of this slab game and the language that is embedded in it. That is, I say slab, and that has consequences for your behavior." He says we could conceive of this slab game as a complete primitive language, he says. He says also we could imagine it as the whole language of a tribe. Now, I think that's actually right. That is, I think there's nothing in it, as it were, our concept of a language that makes it necessarily true that a human language, that is something that human beings can learn as a first language, mightn't have this structure. Right? I mean, it might be that simple. However, whatever the story about our concept of a language is, one thing that's very striking is that, as a matter of fact, natural languages are never like that. Okay? Natural languages never come with the simplicity of the slab game. For one thing, natural languages, in natural languages, and this is just a way of making the productivity point that I was making before, in natural languages, there are always an infinite number of semantically distinct syntactic forms. Right? You can say 1 + 1 is 2, and 2 + 2 is 4, and John believes, and it's raining, and John believes Mary, it's raining, John believes it's raining, Mary said John believes it's raining, Bill thought Mary said John believes it's raining, it's surprising that Bill thought that John said Mary, and so on. Okay. So that's, I mean, natural languages are always productive in that way. Put that to one side, because I promised not for these purposes to use productivity arguments. Natural languages always also have this other property. They're also systematic. And what I mean by saying that they're systematic is this. You never will find a language, I claim, in which you can say, as you can say in Wittgenstein's slab language, you bring me a slab, but you can't say, I'll bring you a slab, and you can't say, don't bring me a slab, and you can't say, bring me more than one slab, and you can't say, in effect, bring me a slab on Tuesday. If you can say any of, or, you know, I'll have my grandmother bring you a slab on Tuesday, all that stuff. If you can say any of these things in a natural language, you'll be able to say, roughly speaking, all of them. Let me just by shorthand, by way of shorthand for this, take the following case, though it's one case out of very, very, very many. This is a very general and pervasive fact about languages. If in a language you're able to say, if the language provides a linguistic form, a form of words for saying that John loves Mary, then I guarantee you it will also provide a form of words for saying that Mary loves John. And quite generally, if you can express in a language the proposition that A or B, that is that A bears the relation R to B, John loves Mary, for example, then you will also be able to express in that language you will find in that language some form of words which allows you to express the proposition that B are A, that, for example, Mary loves John. Okay? I don't mean that if one of them is true, the other will be true. That's certainly not the case. In fact, the history of Western literature is rooted in the observation that from Mary loves John, it does not follow that John loves Mary. most, except for the Odyssey, except for the Iliad, all of Western literature is about that. So it's not that if one formula will be true, the other one will be. But what is the case is if the language provides you with a form of words to say one of these things, it will also provide you with a form of words to say the other. That's what I mean by saying that natural languages are systematic. If they provide you with the expressive power, with the mechanism to express one proposition, one state of affairs, they will provide you with the expressive power to say a lot, to express a lot of other semantically related states of affairs, and moreover, the vehicles of these expressions will generally be syntactically related, just as the English expression "John loves Mary" is syntactically related to the English expression "Mary loves John." That, I claim, is a linguistic universal. If you find, if somebody in your anthropology department comes and says, "Listen, I found an unsystematic language. It works like the Slav language. You can say John loves Mary, but you can't say Mary loves John." Fire. There aren't any such languages. Okay, so I think. Now, what's the explanation of the fact that natural languages are systematic? Answer: the explanation of the fact that natural languages are systematic is exactly like the explanation of the fact that natural languages are productive. That is, sentences have syntactic and semantic structure. And the general idea is that if you can express one proposition by using a form of words with a certain structure, the elements of that structure will be the ones that you use to express the related proposition. What does that mean? Well, look, suppose that English syntax works a bit like this. Suppose English syntax says, there are sentences, and sentences are made up out of noun phrases and verb phrases. And noun phrases can include can be either John or Mary, and verb phrases can be loves. Okay, suppose that's what the syntax of English looks like. Then, with that much apparatus, you've said that both the expression "John loves Mary" and the expression that's not going to quite work. I want sentences to be, and VPs to be good. So sentences can be noun phrases with plus verb phrases, and verb phrases can be verbs plus noun phrases. Okay. With that much apparatus, you've already committed yourself to saying that if the expression "John loves Mary" is in the language, so is the expression "Mary loves John." If the language has resources to say one of these things, it will have the resources to say the other. Why is this true? Well, intuitively, because look, the formula that expresses the proposition that John loves Mary is just made out of the same parts, rearranged, as the formula that expresses the proposition that Mary loves John. So if you're in a position to express one of these formulas, if you have control over the parts and control over the relations, over the principles for putting the parts together to make significant expressions, then if you can express one of these propositions, you'll be able to express the other. Notice the basic idea is that the reason the language is systematic is that the form of words that's used to say John loves Mary isn't an idiom. It has syntactical structure. Right? It contains the word John, the word loves, and the word Mary, the very words you need to express the proposition that Mary loves John. It's all self-evident. There's nothing surprising or deep about it, except, of course, that it does depend on the assumption that English sentences have syntactic and semantic structure. That it's not an accident that the very same word that appears as the subject of loves in John loves Mary appears as the object of loves in Mary loves John. Okay? That's what it is for English to have syntactic structure. And given that English has syntactic structure, we can explain the systematicity of the language. What has all this got to do with thought? Well, there's an obvious point about thought. That is, it's systematic too. Just as you won't find a natural language in which you can say John loves Mary, but can't say Mary loves John, so you won't find a creature who can think that John loves Mary, but can't think that Mary loves John. The class of thoughts that's accessible to us is systematic in just the same way as the class of sentences that's accessible to us is systematic. Indeed, it's a very good thing that it works out that way, because there's no use in your language being systematic and your language being used to express your thoughts unless your thoughts are systematic too, right? I mean, the very fact that English speakers have an expression that they use to say that John loves Mary and another expression that they use to express their thought that Mary loves John suggests that if you have the one thought, you have the other, you can have the other thought, right? The symmetry, the systematicity of the language wouldn't do you any good unless your thoughts were systematic in a corresponding way, okay? So here's a fact. Just as natural language, the current